And we're going to start by talking about looking at medical evidence. Now, up until this point, we've really talked a lot about various research methods and kind of the basics of study design and the basics of bias and things like that. But what we're really trying to get, by the end of this class, I don't expect you to be able to go out and design a study on your own, or to be able to analyze a study. But I do expect you to be able to pick up an article that somebody else has written and be able to determine whether or not what they did was probably correct, right? Whether or not they actually have accounted for the potential bias that could have been in their study. So things like that. I expect you to be able to read the literature and be smart about it. Because just because it's published in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean that it's not garbage. I know that's sad. The whole point of peer review process is that we're all going to review and critique and everything will be right, and the fact of the matter is that's just not the case. So it's your job, when you're reading research, to be able to determine whether or not the stuff that you're reading is actually something you should be paying attention to, or if it's something that probably is not accurate. Does anybody know where I stuck my soda? There we go. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit just about backing up to the beginning of research methods. So why we do research in the first place is because we want to know something. There's a question. We don't really know the answer to it. We might think we know the answer to it, but we don't really know the answer to it until we've kind of put it to the test and put it to a study. So the point of us doing these research methods is in order to be able to identify the answer to whatever question that we have. And then we can take that answer, once we have that answer, and we can then apply it in our practice. So that's the big point, because if you just ask a question and then answer it and move on with your life, that really hasn't gotten you anywhere. If you ask a question, you answer it, and then you use the answer to then influence what you're doing, that's when you've made some type of change. So really that's what we're trying to do. So there's a couple of ways that we determine what we know. So it could be somebody told me. I tell you things and then I expect you just to believe them and agree with them, and I have told you that information and now you know it, right? There's other things where you actually experienced it, so experiential knowledge. So there's knowledge somebody that was an expert told me, and then there's knowledge that I actually experienced it and therefore it is true. There's a decent amount of evidence that things that we experience stick with us a lot longer than things that somebody tells us, for whatever it's worth. All right. So when I tell you something, or when we believe that we know something, there's a couple of ways that we can all agree that this knowledge has been created. The first is traditions. So tradition simply accepts that knowledge is cumulative. So we build on what has happened before. So we take what has happened before, we learn from it, and then any new knowledge is the addition, the building on the existing information. So tradition is a really great source of knowledge if we're talking about it. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth. Just because we have always done something a particular way doesn't mean that's necessarily the best way to do it, right? Things can change. We come up with new information. So tradition is a good source of knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's infallible. We can look at authority. Authority is me telling you that something is true and you having to believe it, right? Authority is a person that is supposedly an expert in a field, gives you the information, and since they are the authority on the matter, you can say, okay, yes, obviously the experts think this, and therefore it is so. And people are generally more likely to believe information that comes from somebody who is deemed an expert in the field versus somebody who is not an expert. You're probably more likely to believe something that's about the biases involved in case control studies from me than you are from your music teacher, right? Generally speaking. But even this authority figures are not infallible. People make mistakes. People hand out the wrong information, right? So you can't just accept it on blind faith all the time that something that an expert says is actually true. We have reasoning. Reasoning is assuming that if we look at something logically, that we will come to the correct conclusion. So if you use the rules of logic, you will find the right answer. It implies that we use logical reasoning. Very often, that is not the case. Humans are emotional beings, and so we don't necessarily logically work through things that even if we think we're logically working through things. And It's also, widely shared beliefs can also be due to faulty reasoning, right? And then we have intuition. I've experienced it, or I think that's probably the way it is. I intuitively think that this is the way it is, and so therefore I think I know the answer to that. And these are all just ways that we can gain knowledge, right? So how do we know what we think we know? There's actually this study of how we know, right? So ontology refers to the study of what is reality. It's more of a philosophical viewpoint than I care to deal with. Had enough philosophy in college, I don't need any more of it. Dude, nothing will give you a headache as much as a philosophy class. I don't know if any of you are philosophers, but you walk out of there with a migraine every day. Anyway, epistemology is the science of knowing, whereas methodology is the science of finding out. Methodology can be considered a subset of epistemology. And really, we're getting to the point that we want to be scientists. We care about science. And science is a word that gets thrown around a lot. But basically, knowledge gathered by scientific means of knowledge. So we're talking about the scientific method that you all learned about probably when you were in second grade, right? Everything we've done up to this point, we've alluded to the scientific method, but we haven't specifically talked about it. When we're talking about the scientific method, we're really talking about you come up with a theory. You have a theory of why something's working. You have a research question. You're not sure what's going on, so you pose this research question. You hypothesize what the answer will be. You say, okay, based on what I know and based on what the theory is telling me, I think that this is what's going to happen. You test your hypothesis using some type of study. So all the studies we've talked about up to this point, except for the descriptive and exploratory ones, any of the analytical studies, we're talking about testing a hypothesis. And then we take that hypothesis and we draw a conclusion based on our study results, and then we revise our theory. It's a nice circular process. The important thing to know is that science is empiric and logically structured. So there's lots of ways. So an authority figure telling you something is a way of gaining knowledge, but that's not necessarily empiric and logically structured. The other point of science that's important is that it should always be public. Because if science is public, when you publish results of science, when you publish your results, and you describe exactly how you did it and what you did so that other people can replicate it, you can be fairly confident that you're actually telling the truth, right? That if people can replicate what you're doing, if people can read and understand what you've done, they can be more confident that you have actually followed the rules, followed the scientific rules. Let's see, I lost my place. Oh, and the one main huge important point is that science is tentative, it's cumulative, and we never accept the answer that we get as the final answer. You can always question the results. So, for years and years and years, the authority figures and the best available evidence said that you were supposed to put babies to bed on their stomach to keep them from aspirating if they spit up in the middle of the night. So people kept saying, I don't know if this is really the best way to do it. Lots of babies died from SIDS, lots of babies died from this. Let's look at this. And when they finally analyzed all the data and actually looked at the problem scientifically, they realized, hey, babies die when you put them to bed on their stomach. Not all babies, but there's a much higher risk of SIDS for babies that are put to sleep on their stomach than babies that are put to sleep on their back. So then there was this huge back to sleep campaign, and they started putting babies to sleep on their back. You guys are all you were all back sleeping babies. When I was a baby, they still put you to bed in your stomach, so it's a miracle that any of us lived. But science, you can't ever accept the conclusions of things that have happened before as the true definitive truth. You can always question what's going on. And anybody that gets upset that you're questioning their findings either really needs a personality adjustment or maybe hiding something. Possibly both. Alright. So there's a few assumptions when we're talking about the approaches to knowledge. Nature is orderly. we can actually know it. So there is an answer, there's an order to the way the world works, we actually can know that answer, we can find it out. That all natural phenomena have natural causes. So we don't think that the little blue spirit is walking through the room and sprinkling fairy dust and giving everybody a cold, right? Nothing is self-evident. So just because something seems like it would be the intuitive way to do something doesn't mean that that's necessarily the true way that it should be done. Knowledge is based on experience. And finally, knowledge is superior to ignorance. The more you know, the better able you are to understand the universe, and the better able you are to act in this world. So there's 4 purposes that we do research. So we talked kind of about just the general idea behind the science and the scientific method. But there's 4 reasons that we do research. We do it to describe our populations or our environment. We do it to predict something. We do it to explain something that we've seen. So we've seen all these observations, we want to explain why that's going on. And then we do it to evaluate our actions. These are all the reasons that we conduct research. But what we use with it, what we do with it, so we have all our reasons why we conduct research, but what we really want to do is get to the point where we're talking about evidence-based practice. And evidence-based practice is still, it's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot now. It's still relatively new in the world of medicine, and even much newer in worlds of psychology and social work and other clinical fields, nursing, things like that. The idea behind evidence-based practice is simply we use research and we use the best available evidence to then determine how we treat our patients, or determine what the best course of action is. That's a pretty logical thing to think, right? So we should do our research, and then once we've done research, the answer should be there, and then we should be able to apply that. Unfortunately, the field typically in the past it wasn't what the science was saying. It was like all these people over here in this silo did their science and said these are the best things that should be done. And all these people over here practiced medicine and said, well, this is the way we've always done it, and so that's the way we're going to do it. And it's only been relatively recently, like the past 30, 40 years, that these two things have really started to come together. And now the fields of medicine and nursing and most clinically oriented fields are starting to talk about we need to take the research and transition it into what we're actually doing in our practice. That doesn't mean that we come up with like a checklist and a cookbook of how things are have to do. You still have to kind of use your brain. But we do want to base our decisions not on a whim, but on what we think is actually going to work. So evidence-based practice involves evaluating yourself, your programs, your interventions, and your policies. So once again, we never take anything as being self-evident. We have this great intervention that we think is going to reduce teen smoking. But we don't just apply the intervention and say, hey, we've done our job. You apply your intervention, you look to see if it has worked, and then if it didn't work, you kind of figure out why, and you go back and revise and start again, right? All right. So there's 6 main steps in evidence-based practice. First, you ask your question. I have a patient that has walked in the door and has these 5 symptoms, and I think they have this. What's the best course of treatment, given that then I know that they have 5 comorbid conditions? Then you search for the evidence. So you go and research. This doesn't mean you're creating your own evidence. This means you're going and searching the literature. You're going to search and see what other people have done. Then you get to the point where now that you've searched and you've come up with this whole pile of articles, you have to say, okay, how do I decide what is the best article? What are the things that are most applicable to my situation? How do I know that this research article is actually worth anything? How do I know that they've come to valid conclusions? Once you determine what the best evidence is, you have to determine whether or not that particular best evidence is actually appropriate for your patient population. You then can apply your evidence-based intervention. So you give your treatment, whatever you think the best treatment is. You apply your population intervention. And then you evaluate what you did. Did it work? Did my patient get better? did this teen smoking rate go down? And once you've evaluated, you give feedback and you start over again. So it really, instead of a linear thing, it really kind of should be a little circle. Which leads us to the point that all science is not good science. Kind of where I started. There is a lot of published literature that is just plain wrong. People used methods that were inappropriate for the question they were asking. People used statistical methods that were inappropriate for the type of data they had. Now, if you're not a statistician, you're probably not going to catch all of that, but you can catch a lot of it just from the way that people talk about it. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. But so, a big part of you when you walk out into the world and you're now hospital administrators or wherever you end up, and you're having to make decisions about policy, you're going to have to make those decisions based on the evidence. And so you're going to have to pull it and read it and say, hey, does this make sense? Is this good science? So let's walk through these common problems. These are by no means all the problems that can come about, but these are the kind of the big ones that you usually see. The first one is an accurate observation. Failing to see things that are right from us, or mistakenly observing things that aren't there. So, or misinterpreting what you see. Overgeneralization refers to assuming that a few similar events are evidence of everything, or evidence of the whole. So generally speaking, stereotypes can be considered overgeneralizations, right? Or you had a neighbor who only had one leg and therefore never walks their dog. And so you assume that everybody with one leg only never walks their dog. Right? That's an overgeneralization. It's a very bad example, but a good point. Selective observation is when you pay attention only to the things that prove your point. Selective observation was a serious problem in this past election. Right? People only pay attention to the things that make their point, and then they ignore everything else in the evidence base. Ex post facto hypothesizing. Isn't that a fun little phrase? You find your evidence and then you go back and change your hypothesis to fit. So when you have the scientific method, if you're following it properly, you have your research question, you hypothesize what you think is going to happen, you do your little study, and you come up with an answer. And then you determine whether or not your answer was consistent with your hypothesis. Ex post facto, it should be facto, not factor, I'm sorry. Hypothesizing is when you do your study and you find out your results don't actually match your hypothesis, so you change your hypothesis to match your results after the fact. Not cool. Can't do that. Ego involvement and understanding refers to allowing your personal involvement into situations to color your interpretation of the events. This is why blinding becomes so important. Because you don't want what you know and what you feel to color what the results are. Illogical reasoning. It's just what it sounds like, but it can include things like the gambler's fallacy. Anybody want to take a guess at what the gambler's fallacy is?
Say you have a 1 in 100 chance of winning something. If you didn't get it the first 99 times, you think you're going to get it the 100th attempt?
Yeah, essentially. So there's people that sit there at slot machines and are like, it hasn't hit the past 20, so it's obviously going to hit the next one. Or the ones where somebody wins big on a slot machine and then all those old ladies go over and run over to that machine thinking that's going to pay out again. Or that, that's exactly. So the gambler's fallacy is essentially thinking that because something hasn't happened that it has to happen the next time. We also have, under illogical reasoning, the straw person argument. This also comes up a lot in politics. The straw person argument is when you attack a position, not by attacking what's actually going, but by the person that's giving, that's stating the position. So, for example, when people use the term death panels when they were talking about insurance reform, fact, right? So instead of saying, what was the other word that they were called? Completely blanking. Does everybody remember the death panels phrase, or is that? I mean, that's an emotionally loaded phrase, right? So instead of talking about what these insurance companies were actually doing when they're making decisions about who's getting what kind of treatment, they termed them death panels. Ad hominem attack, discrediting the person instead of addressing the argument. Similar, right? Premature closure of inquiry refers to a situation where someone has decided that they know the answer and therefore there's no more research needed, or they will not listen to any more information about it. It is done, case closed, this is the way it is. Alright, so all of these things are important in understanding what you're reading. You need to know about all the ways that things might be a little messed up before you can understand what you need to look for when you're actually looking at literature. So, when we're looking at the literature, there's a few things we have to concentrate on. First, you have to understand that literature involves more than just finding articles that are relevant to your study question. It involves critically appraising them. You have to be able to find the articles, so you want to find the right information that is on the topic that you're interested in, but you also want to then identify whether or not it's good information. So, you have to look at things, populations that were studied. If you're interested in diabetes in Native American populations, but you only look at studies in diabetes in white and African American populations, they may not be similar. People may not respond the same to treatments. You have to make sure that the populations that are in your research are somewhat similar to the populations that you're actually interested in applying your information to. Now, sometimes that information doesn't exist, and then you have to make choices. But you want to look at what populations have been studied in the context of the problem you're interested in. At what level? So we talked about the ecological level, right, when we're talking about things that are on aggregate. Well, if a question has only been addressed on an ecological level, you can't talk about it on an individual level. You can't make assumptions that that individual relationship is the same. And just as a review, what's that called when you do that?
Ecological fallacy?
Yes, ecological fallacy, exactly. You want to look at what constructs and variables people have used. So constructs refers to the actual kind of concept of underlying latent trait that you're interested in. The variable is actually the data that you collected. You want to know what measures and tests did people use to examine your outcomes or your exposure variables? How did they determine who was sick? How did they determine who had a particular outcome? Are there theories that exist in this area? Are the findings of this article consistent with existing theories, or are they leading you down a different path? What study designs have been used to assess this problem? What are the findings? And most importantly, what are the gaps? What's missing? Because that's where you identify new and fun aspects for additional research. Is by identifying what aspects of that question haven't been asked yet. So this is all good and well, but you have to find your literature first. So how do we do that? There's lots of places you can get literature, or you can get scientific information. You get it from books and government reports and journals, the internet, scientific meetings, just by talking to people. Now, let's walk through the overall quality of these particular things. Books are great when you're trying to learn a base knowledge about a field that's been around for a while, that's not changing a lot. If you want to learn about the anatomical structure of the heart, you can probably find a textbook that exists. Like, that's not changing, right? But if you're interested in something that's really current or that's a new and emerging field, books are probably not the best way to go because books take forever to get published. So by the time books get published, a lot of the information might be out of date if it's something that's in a new and emerging and exciting field, right? Government reports, great sources of information, generally fairly accurate. You can kind of count on those being an okay source of information to believe what you're reading. Obviously not always, but for the most part you can. Journals, peer-reviewed journals, obviously are a great source of the most current, up-to-date information. That's where that's where the new and exciting findings are coming out. They also come out in scientific meetings, but the information in scientific meetings is not as rigorously reviewed as the stuff that comes out in journals. The internet. The internet, every researcher in the world, well, okay, researchers love the internet, teachers hate the internet. Basically, because the internet is a source of a lot of inaccurate information. And you have to know which sites are things that you can believe and which sites are things that you cannot believe. So you can get a lot of really great information on the internet. Obviously, I sent you on several web quests trying to find information, but you need to make sure that you're using a trusted source. So university websites, government websites, a lot of times things like the American Diabetic Association websites. Those are usually trusted sources of information. Fred so-and-so over there, maybe not, unless he's considered an expert in that particular field. You might want to check his facts before you decide to believe what he's writing, right? So, just for time's sake, we're going to go ahead and skip over this. Talk about organizing your search. When you are searching the literature, it's a much more difficult skill, I think, than people initially anticipate. You think you can just type something into a student search engine and it's going to go and you're going to find everything you need. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You have to have a purpose. You have to state your reason. You have to state what you are looking for. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, how are you going to know when you find it? Right? So you need to be able to specifically state the purpose of your search. Then you need to figure out where you're going to search. Do you want to do just a general Google search? Because if you do a general Google search, you're going to come up with a whole lot of stuff from various sources. Do you want to go through a library database? Do you only care about the medical literature, so you're just going to look in PubMed? Do you only care about the psychological literature, so you're just going to look in PsycInfo? If you look on the library website, there's a list of 30 different databases, probably more than that, for various fields of research. Now, there's something to be said about searching databases outside of your actual field of interest, because sometimes people have studied your problem in a different manner, just in, I don't know, the world of business or something. So you don't want to necessarily limit yourself, but it's a good idea to decide which databases you're going to use. Then you need to identify your keywords. So what words are you going to use to search your database? That's when you go and call your librarian and say, I don't know how to find this, please help me. And then you conduct your search. Once you've conducted your search, you have to then pull all your articles, which means that you have to know how to get those articles. Never ceases to amaze me how a second-year master's student doesn't know how to access an article from the library, but this has happened to me recently. The library has articles, and you can get them for free because you're a student. It's great. So we have access to all these, and you don't even have to go there. Now you can get it online. They'll just send it to your email, right? But if they don't have something, they'll find it for you. All you have to do is ask. Call it interlibrary loan, and you say, hey, can you find this for me? And they do it, and it's amazing. But if you learn nothing else before you leave this class, please know that you can get information from the library, and they will give it to you. Once you have these articles, and dear God, don't just pull the abstracts from the reference and read the abstracts and think that you are done. You are not done. You do not have the information that you need if you just read the abstract. And anyone who has ever taught any research methods class in the entire universe knows if you've just read the abstract. Very obvious. You need to pull the whole article, and you need to read the whole article. Because there's probably information in there that's going to help you assess whether or not the study was done well. 250 words is not enough to tell somebody what they need to know. So then, once you have pulled the full article, when I say abstract pertinent information, that means you read the article and you pull out the information that you think is important. Then you can summarize your findings. And when you've done this for several articles, you can say, okay, all the information seems to be consistent, or you can say, oh my gosh, everybody comes to a different conclusion. Why is that? But until you read the articles, you will not know. So, this is just general housekeeping stuff. Keep them organized, otherwise you will keep pulling the same article over and over and over again. Now we'll get to critiquing the literature. Basically, you need to ask yourself a bunch of questions every time you read an article. How strong was the study design? You all should be able to answer that at this point. We've walked through kind of strengths and weaknesses of basic study designs. Obviously, there's going to be variation. Each person's going to do things a little bit differently, but you should be able to determine how strong the study is. If they did an experimental study, is that a stronger or weaker study design than a cross-sectional study? Say that louder. Stronger, right? So you all should be able to determine this by now. I could give you an article and you can look at it and you can say, okay, their study design was susceptible to these types of biases. How well was the study carried out? Did it appear that they had a protocol and followed it? Or did it appear that they said they were going to do this and then that's not what happened? Were the results correctly analyzed and interpreted? This is tricky if you don't have a lot of statistical background, but you can generally get a sense. They have this results section, and are the stuff that they're saying in the discussion section, does that make sense in the context of the stuff that's in the results section? How applicable are the findings to what you're interested in? So it's great that it was a wonderful study, but if the findings have nothing to do with what the question you're interested in, you've just wasted 45 minutes of your life. You want to look at the objective of the study. Every study should state the objective. Why did they conduct this study? Did the research design and the analysis they did actually pertain to the objective that they stated at the beginning? Who was in the study? What was the study design? How did they select the groups? Were people randomly assigned to groups? Were people randomly sampled from the population? Where did these people come from? You want to look at the generalizability. Okay, so we have these group of people. Are the people that were in the study representative of the larger population? Did they clearly define the exposures and outcomes? Do I really know which variables they were using and how they were measured? Did the authors provide any information on the reliability or validity of their instruments? So they said these use these particular questions to get at the exposure and outcomes. But do they have any information? Did they tell me whether or not those questions have been piloted and pre-tested? Whether or not those questions actually are getting the information that they want to look. How did the authors deal with confounding and effect modification? Did they? Did they assess it at all?
If you're getting these articles from like a certain, like I guess trusted source, so like a peer-reviewed website or something like that, shouldn't you just kind of trust that?
No, you should absolutely not. You should absolutely not. People if it's from JAMA, they're probably a little safer.
Like I'm saying, like certain sources, wouldn't they have not allowed?
One would think, but so the way peer review works, right? You submit an article to a journal, and generally speaking, you have to submit some suggested people to review it. And so that's usually somebody who's an expert in that particular field, but it could be your friend. I don't know. So they're blindly reviewed. So I'm a reviewer. Somebody sends me an article, and they say, "Here's an article in an area that you should know something about. You have stated that you know something about." Nobody gave me a test to say that I am an expert in measurement theory. But because I said I'm an expert in measurement theory, then they send me stuff on measurement. Right? And so they send it to me, and then I read the article, and I say, "Yeah, you did a good job," and send it back. Or I actually read it and rip it to shreds, but I missed the point. Right? There's a lot of things that can happen. So they usually send it out to 3 reviewers. And sometimes if you've submitted a manuscript back, and you get it back, and you have 3 different reviewers that said 3 different opposite things, and you may or may not make changes based on that, you send it back to the journal, and then they send it back to different reviewers. And so if the 3 reviewers that got your paper didn't understand the methods that you used, it's quite possible that they didn't understand you did it wrong, if you sounded smart when you wrote it.
Well, that might have been a bad example. But like a government website.
Well, I mean, so there's a difference between the quality of a study and kind of information. So the government gets their information from somewhere, right? So the government information is typically not results of studies. The government information is typically like demographic statistics. And so they have, I mean, there's studies that are done on these, but so they have like the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. The purpose of the government doing that is to be able to assess the prevalence of various diseases within the population. So they have very strict methods of how the data is collected. They have very strict methods of how it's analyzed in-house to identify prevalence of these certain conditions. But then the data is released to the public. And so now I can download the data, and I can say, hey, I have a research question, and I think that I might be able to answer with this data. But they have nothing to do with how I decide to analyze that data. So generally speaking, peer-reviewed is a good place to go. It's a much more trustworthy source than just Joe Schmo off the internet, right? However, you still have to look at it with a critical eye because some things slip past. It just happens. It does. And it's not necessarily people were trying to do it wrong, they just didn't know. They're testing on a new method and they completely lost sight of it, or they didn't have the right clinical experts, and so they asked the wrong question. But unfortunately, it's your job to figure out whether or not it's something you can trust. So, does that answer your question? Kind of roundabout way. The moral of the story is really you need to look at everything with a critical eye and don't believe everything until you've actually looked at it. Which is why I read some study recently about health, like the media reporting health news. So most health reporters actually have no training in scientific reporting at all. And so they'll pick one line from a study and take it out of context and then blow it up, and you hear this whole, this huge blow up about things that weren't actually the point of the study at all, but because nobody read the full study. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. I know there is one. I'll come up with them later on. But you can't just trust because a health reporter said that this is the finding, that was actually the finding. One sentence out of context doesn't really tell you what the point of the study was. But so this is all talking about reviewing original research. So when people have actually conducted a study on their own, and you need to look and assess whether or not that study was well done. Fortunately, sometimes there are people that create review articles and they do all the hard work for you. They do the heavy lifting for you. Now, you need to make sure that the review article is done well. Review articles kind of operate under separate criterion, so you have to clearly state what you're trying to review. You have to clearly state what articles made it into your study, what articles you didn't review, why you chose not to review certain ones, how did you find the articles. But review articles are an excellent source for an overview of the state of the problem at that point in time. Because they took all those original research articles and have already consolidated them. So the Cochrane Review, has anybody heard of Cochrane Review? Great source. That's all they really do. They've come up with, like, they wrote the book on systematic reviews, literally wrote the book on systematic reviews. And the Cochrane collaboration is essentially this group of people that do nothing but consolidate research in various areas so that they can tell you the state of the evidence. And so Cochrane Review is a great place to go. It's a trustworthy source. Their reviews are done very methodologically rigorously. You can generally trust that the reviews were done correctly. And so the information that you get is really a good consolidation of what the literature is at large. And if you're just looking for the answer to a problem, that's the place you want to start. Two things, there's two types of review articles that come about, that you find. There's systematic reviews and there's meta-analysis. A systematic review is simply, you read all the articles and you've made statements about consolidating the information. You haven't done any math in there. You just kind of talked about what the findings are. A meta-analysis tries to statistically combine all the studies. So if you have 10 different studies that have kind of smaller sample sizes, they attempt to combine the information from all of those studies to get an overall effect size for whatever the answer to the problem was. So meta-analysis involves statistics. Systematic review does not. Both types are consolidating information from a variety of articles. All right. So that's all the fun stuff about critiquing the literature. Trying to decide if it's... Nope, we're going to take a little break before you have to listen to me talk again. I have articles here, and then at the end of the article is in-class questions. So you guys are going to do a really quick and dirty literature or article critique right now. We will take 20 minutes. So if you don't read super closely, I just want you all to read through it, skim the article for the most part, and then answer the questions at the end. Once you do that, we'll come back and we'll just talk about all of those, and we'll kind of talk about how we see if we came to the same conclusions, identified the same problems and the same strengths in the article. And then after that, we'll go ahead and do the next lecture. So that way we get a little break. Alright, I think pretty much everyone is back. Hopefully you guys noticed that it was up in Blackboard because apparently page 22 was missing from the copy. Did everyone get that?
There's 3 pages missing.
There were 3 pages missing? Okay. Excellent. That's what happens when you do things through the copy machine. But everybody was able to find them? Did you guys actually look up the rest of it? Read it? Yes? No? Maybe? Did you skip it? There you go. Well, we'll walk through them, so it'll be okay. Alright, so what was the objective of this particular study?
Evaluate if there was a connection between exercise and diabetes.
Yes, but you're missing one important component.
2 different ethnicities.
Yes, there you go.
What
Among different ethnicities. So it wasn't just to look at the determinant of diabetes, the risk of diabetes was reduced if you exercised. It was to look at whether or not that was different among groups. What is it called?
Stratification.
Stratification. And what's the other thing? So we stratified, but what were we actually? What's the brain stopped working? What is it called when you have one variable when the influence of the exposure and outcome is different across levels of a different variable? It's not confounding.
Modified.
Yes, effect modification. That's right. So they were really their actual goal here was to examine effect modification, right? So what was the study design of this study in the article? Yeah.
So there's a study of postmenopausal women over the course of 4 to 6 years.
Mm-hmm. What is that called? Yes. What kind of cohort? A prospective cohort. Now, was this a fixed cohort or a dynamic cohort? It was a dynamic cohort. Excellent. All right. So who was the population? The overall population that they were interested in. Who was that?
Postmenopausal women.
Yes. There you go. Women. Postmenopausal. Was there random sampling? Someone from this side of the room. Was there random sampling? No, there was not. There was not random sampling, that's right. Where did those people come from then?
Did they enroll people from the Women's Health Initiative that had either been accepted or screened for that study?
Exactly, yes. So there was another study that people had been involved in, and they enrolled people that had been in that study, or that were in that study. So how did they select the study groups? Who was included? Anyone? Who made it into the study? So they enrolled people from the Women's Health Initiative, right? Who made it into this study? Or better yet, who didn't make it into this study?
Women who were diabetic or taking antidiuretic medicine or people that became diabetic within a year of the study were excluded.
Exactly. And why do you think those women were excluded?
Which ones?
All of those women. So all of those women were excluded from the study.
Because they already had diabetes.
Because they already had diabetes, and this was a prospective cohort study, right? And what is the number one thing that's important in a prospective cohort study?
Everybody's okay to start.
Everyone's disease-free at the beginning. So if people had diabetes at the beginning, then they are obviously not disease-free. They have the disease that we're interested in, so we can't use them. Were they randomized to treatment groups?
I feel like there wasn't really a treatment. Because it was more like self-exercise.
Exactly. So no, they were not randomized treatment groups, and this was an observational study, so they wouldn't have been randomized anyway. But no, there was no intervention here. All right. Let's see, what was the main study outcome? The outcome variable. What is the outcome variable? Let's back up. What's an outcome variable in this particular instance?
Whether or not they develop diabetes.
Exactly. That's the outcome. Diabetes. So if you're studying a disease, the outcome is typically the disease, right? So whether or not they develop type 2 diabetes. How did they operationalize that outcome? How did they determine, what did they do to classify people as having type 2 diabetes?
They all like self-report.
They were self-report, exactly. And where did they get that information?
I don't know, there was like a questionnaire that I think they sent them that like, were they getting like medication from the doctor?
Exactly.
Like that.
So they operationalized it as people that reported taking anti-diabetic medication. That's important when we start talking about bias. Because they operationalized it, people reported whether or not they were taking diabetic medication. They did not report, yes, I have type 2 diabetes, no, I did not. That's not how it was operationalized in the study. It was whether or not they were taking insulin or some other oral anti-diabetic agent. Anti-hyperglycemic. All right. So what was the main study exposure? If the main outcome was diabetes, what was the exposure that they were interested in?
Physical activity.
Physical activity, exactly. And since this wasn't a quasi-experimental design, it wasn't an experimental design, nobody was given an intervention. They just assessed whether or not they were physically active. How did they operationalize physical activity? Somebody besides you three. Anyone else in the class? Do I need to make everybody go back and read it again? How was it determined if somebody was physically active or not? How did they classify those people? What questions did they ask them? One of you three.
Us?
Yeah.
Why you gotta pick on us?
Because you're sitting in the front. Because you were falling asleep earlier and therefore I'm coming.
Okay. Didn't they measure body mass index as well?
They did measure body mass index, but that doesn't tell us what physical activity they were doing, right?
Based off duration of time.
Of
Moderate to strenuous physical activity.
right. So they asked them, do you walk? How fast do you walk? They and other activities. So they asked about walking and they asked about other things. So it was like, how much do you do it, how long do you do it, and how intense is it? And they use those things to classify. I'm just going to pick on you for the rest of the class. If you're going to fall asleep, sit in the back.
This is ridiculous.
I have no sympathy for people who are tired. I never sleep. I am always tired. All right, so they had these things. They asked them how long they walked. They asked them the duration. They asked them how vigorous. Did anybody actually see how they were operationalizing vigorous activity?
And the first journey is that they gave them definition, like if you sweated and if your heartbeat got faster.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so they actually classified it. It wasn't just like, do you think you're working hard? It's here's what we call working hard. How are you classifying it based on that? Right. Because they gave them some points at which to assess that. All right. So how did the authors deal with confounding and effect modification? So we know they deal with effect modification by one of you girls that's not looking at me. How do they deal with effect modification? Because one of the fundamental components of their research question was effect modification. What did they do? How do you always look at effect modification? It's one word, and it's already been said.
You ask them? You ask them?
No, we have. Thank you for talking. So you get points just for volunteering an answer. when we have effect modification and we're trying to assess whether something is an effect modifier, the first step is to what? Starts with an S. Stratify. Yes. We stratify, we break them into groups. So they dealt with effect modification the same way you always do. They stratified into groups. Now what did they do about confounding? Because they did assess confounding, and they assessed confounding within each of the strata. What did they do?
That's like how they adjusted for age.
Exactly. So how did they adjust for it?
That I don't know.
That's kind of tricky because I don't know if I ever directly said how that's done. So they used multivariate modeling, right? They in their regression models they included covariates. That's how when you have a bunch of confounders, you're trying to assess them all at one time. So when we talked about confounding earlier, we were only looking at one confounder, which you can do using a stratified analysis like we did earlier a couple of weeks ago. When you're looking at multiple confounders, you typically have to do a multivariable model. And so if people are doing multivariable models, generally they're trying to control for other factors. And when they say control for other factors, they're talking about confounding. Yes?
They also looked at like smoking.
Now the real question is, did they simply control for other factors, or did they actually assess to see if those factors were confounders?
I think they just controlled for
They just controlled for them, right? So, what you are supposed to do, according to the textbooks, and any teacher that teaches FE region, yeah?
Wait, how did they control for that?
Using multivariate modeling, so they ran a regression, but they included not only their exposure and their outcome in the regression, but also all the other variables, and by doing that, you parsed out the variability that's due to those other variables, and therefore.
So like, they could have either controlled it or they could have done, what would the other option have been?
The other option would be stratified analysis, the way we did it in class.
Okay.
That's how you determine if a variable is a confounder. So if they have been looking for confounders and they've actually been taught, so what you're supposed to do is determine whether or not that variable is a confounder in your data, and you would do that the way that we did that. At which point, if you concluded that it was a confounder, you would put it in your larger statistical model. In reality, what generally happens is people have a theoretical reason for assuming something is a confounder, and they just put it in. Now, there's lots of debate on which method is actually appropriate. I fall somewhere in between the truly confounder and truly only theoretically things end up in there, but they didn't actually assess confounding in this particular study. They looked at variables that traditionally in other research were confounders, or that other people controlled for at least, and then they included them in their multivariable model. All right, so what were the major findings?
The Caucasian women were the only one that benefited from the exercising to prevent diabetes. The other ethnicities did not.
Right, so after they controlled for all those other factors, and what was it, alcohol, smoking, education, hypertension, high cholesterol, dietary fiber intake, and energy from carbohydrates. Once they controlled for all of those things, they assumed they were confounders, they put them in the model, they controlled for them. The only people that showed an association of risk reduction in development of diabetes from physical activity were the white women. So, what does that mean? Is race an effect modifier or not?
Yes.
Yeah. Right? Why is race an effect modifier?
Because there's difference. There's a difference between the different races and effects, basically.
Exactly, because there's a different relationship between the exposure and outcome depending on the race. Exactly right. So the exposure-outcome relationship is different across the levels of the third variable, which in this case was race. So what type of bias might have influenced the results?
Some type 2 diabetes is controlled through eating right and exercise. So by just asking by the medication, they were missing all those other people.
Exactly. And do you remember what that's called?
No, not
Misclassification. Yeah, so there were a lot of people that were probably misclassified as not having diabetes when they actually did have diabetes. They just had diabetes that was controlled by diet. And considering that most diabetics are initially controlled by diet, that's probably a fairly substantial number of people. And that's a problem. Now, let's dive. So, if they were missing those people, and if all of the people controlled by diet were, let's say, African American, what do you think that would do to the results?
I mean, if it was already stratified, and if there was already an effect, like modification between the groups, would it just made it like a bigger modification?
Well, it's possible that there's not effect modification. So it's possible that if all of the people that were, if all the white women were just taking meds, and so we correctly classified everybody, but in the African American group, we misclassified a substantial portion of people as not having diabetes, then there may actually be an association between physical activity and reduction in risk of diabetes. We just didn't catch it because there were all those people that were misclassified as not having diabetes, right? And so it's, maybe that's masking something and there's really not an effect modification. There's really not effect modification. I don't know, that's speculation. To say that all of the people that were controlled by diet weren't white is probably stretching it. There's probably some misclassification within all the strata. But in general, you have to look at that. That is a possibility. That could have happened and that would have distorted the results. We also have problems in the fact that it's just self-report. So people just may report it wrong. Or people may not want to tell you what meds they're on. All right, excellent. So that particular little assignment, we should have learned several things. One, we're critically evaluating an article and you should recognize that there's certain things you need to look for. But two, your knowledge of study design, your knowledge of bias, your knowledge of all that stuff relates to all of this. And so I highly recommend that you maybe practice some of these types of skills prior to the final suggestion. You may want to look at some articles and maybe answer these questions again based on other things, just to get an idea, feel for it if you weren't comfortable with it this time around. Because it might be something that appears in the future. I don't know, maybe. All right. But I guarantee you, if you can walk through a study, if you can walk through published literature, and you can identify all these factors and the questions that we talked about in the slide and that were on these papers, you have learned what you need to learn for this class. All right? Let's talk about evaluation of healthcare and measures, and measuring healthcare outcomes. All right. Doesn't work. There we go. So, we're going to talk about evaluation. And how is evaluation slightly different from what we deem research? So evaluation here we have defined as a systematic and scientific process of determining the extent to which an action or set of actions were successful in achievement of predetermined objectives. Blech. That's just a whole bunch of like gobbledygook words. What does that mean? Anyone want to take a guess?
Did they do what they wanted to do or not?
And how are we assessing that?
Systematically.
There we go. That's the right. Systematic is a really important word, right? So we have a structured way of evaluating, of looking at what we did and what happened. So the important thing is that it's not haphazard. It's not like, hey, after the fact, oh my gosh, do you think that worked? Yeah, I think it worked. Okay, we're good. It's, we have a plan in place from start to finish to systematically examine whether or not our program, our intervention, our policy, whatever it is, was actually effective and did the things that we expected it to do. Expected it to do is the predetermined objectives part, right? So we had an idea of what this was supposed to accomplish, and therefore we evaluated it and we wanted to see if it accomplished that. So really the only difference between evaluation and research is your intent. In general, methodologically you do these things the same way. Now, there's certain things you do in evaluation because you have to get buy-in from your community, right? Especially if you're working in a community organization and you want them to participate and do your program, you have to get buy-in, right? So there's a lot of specifics that have to do just with logistics that are slightly different between strict pure research and things that are considered evaluation. But in general, the difference is the purpose and not the methods. So why are we evaluating healthcare? What are we evaluating? Three main things we can evaluate. We can evaluate the inputs, the process, and the outputs. So inputs are the things that go into our healthcare system. So we're talking about money and materials that feed the system. Processes of care are actually what are taking place. How things are taking place within the healthcare system. And the outputs are the effects of those processes. So we have inputs, processes, and outputs. Can anybody think of something that's missing from those three that we might also want to evaluate? So we have the money and things feeding into the system. We have how the doctors are working, how the nurses are working. We have what eventually happens. But we're missing the where. The environment, the healthcare environment can be just as important, so we often have to evaluate that as well. So the physical structures, which is why Donna Bedian, who's heard of him? You guys are health administration, haven't heard the name Donna Bedian? Nope. You will. It should come up. So Donna Bedian is the king of quality improvement, right? He was all about healthcare delivery and healthcare quality and assessment and quality assurance. And so anytime you talk about healthcare quality, his name comes up. And so he came up with the structure, process, outcome kind of framework. A structure is any attribute of the system. A process is the set of organized activities. And then the outcome is an outcome, results from both the structure and the process. So he defined quality as all actions taken to establish, protect, promote, and improve the quality of healthcare. Or quality assurance, I'm sorry. He defined quality assurance as all the actions taken to establish, protect, promote, and improve the quality of healthcare. So this can mean actions to improve nurses' competence in certain areas. This can mean actions by adding extra beds in a unit that needs extra beds. This can be things on a larger scale with talking about kind of insurance payments within a system. But all of these things fall under the structure, process, outcome kind of framework. So why do we care about evaluation in this framework? In order to assure quality, we have to evaluate the things that are going on. So we evaluate the structure, process, outcome cycle. So we've talked about healthcare evaluation being designed, generally speaking, to improve quality and performance of clinicians in healthcare systems or healthcare programs. We're going to concentrate today simply on evaluation of healthcare services, since that's like health services research is in the title of your course, and therefore we should talk about it a little bit. So we're going to focus on healthcare services. So Maxwell has criteria for evaluating healthcare services, and he proposes these 6 things that have to underlie any service. These are the 6 things that have to be there for any quality healthcare service. So we have access. Can people access the system or service that you're talking about? Relevance to the needs of the community. So it's all good and well to put in new, orthopedic unit, but if the big problem in your community is heart problems and not orthopedic problems, there's really not a purpose of doing that, right? The effectiveness for the individual. So is the service doing what it's intended to do for particular individuals within that community? Social acceptability. Does the community deem whatever health services you're providing to be socially acceptable within the cultural norms of that area? And efficiency and economy. So is the system working efficiently? Is it working on a budget? Is it cost effective? So let's talk access to service. a little more specifically is covering both physical and non-physical barriers to access. So it could be, do you have transportation to the hospital? Or it could be, is there a wheelchair ramp so that you can actually get into the hospital? Both those things count as access barriers. Relevance really refers to the needs of the whole community, but relevance is a judgment, and it's usually a judgment based on community needs. So what often happens is that as a society, especially in medicine and other health-related fields, frequently, it's not as much anymore, but frequently, like, physicians have to take in the I know what's best attitude, right? I know what you need. I'm going to give you what you need, but I know what you need. And the idea behind relevance to the needs of the community is that the community decides what they need. Because if they don't think they need it, it doesn't matter if I tell you that you need a walking trail for physical activity. If your community doesn't think they need a walking trail, if they think they need mammography services for the women, they're not going to use that walking trail, right? So it's relevance to the community. The effectiveness for individual patients is really, is your service providing the intended benefit to those individual people? Equity, we're talking about equal access to service for people with similar degrees of illness. So equity doesn't mean that everybody gets the same thing. It means everybody gets what they need. And those are very different kind of concepts. Social acceptability is really, do people deem whatever treatment that you're offering to be acceptable within the context of their culture? And then efficiency and economy, we already talked about faith. Is it efficient? Is it economically viable? So let's kind of go back full circle to what is an outcome. An outcome is simply, it's the end point. It's the result of the service. So we may look at intermediate outcomes, so we can't study people long enough to get to the end. So we'll look at an intermediate outcome that we think influences the end point, or we can look at the final outcome. But when we're talking about outcomes assessment and outcomes and evaluation of health services, we really want to know, did our service have the desired result in the very end of the game? So we're looking at the outcomes. So when we're talking about outcomes assessment, we're really talking about establishing the effectiveness of care, and we're establishing the quality of care. So to establish the effectiveness of care, we're talking about evaluating and identifying what works best for which groups. The big buzzword of, I don't know, probably the next 10 years will be comparative effectiveness research. And the idea behind comparative effectiveness research is that you're head-to-head comparing treatments, you're head-to-head comparing interventions, or types of health systems to see what works best for which people. And then the second objective, so when we're talking about assessing quality of care, we're talking about information that's used to assess quality across providers, or even within providers, pre and post some type of training. And all of this kind of leads back to the idea of accountability within healthcare systems. So we want our healthcare systems and our doctors and our nurses and everybody to be providing the best care based on the best available evidence for the right people at the right time for low cost and yada yada yada. There's a lot of things that we would like to be happening, but a lot of that has to be evaluated before we can determine any of those things. So outcomes can be, we can call outcomes, there's a lot of things that influence outcomes, not just the health system, not just the treatment that your doctor gives. The final outcome is actually a function of how well you were doing at the baseline before you got sick. How well, what types of other patient clinical characteristics. So do you have 5 comorbid illnesses, or are you only sick with 1? Other patient demographic and psychosocial characteristics. So people with depression generally fare worse than people that don't have depression. And also the treatment setting. So there's a whole bunch of different factors that play into whether or not people have favorable outcomes. And so that's why health services evaluation gets so tricky, because we want to be able to say, yes, it was because you went to this particular hospital and that you got better. Well, you really got better because of all of these factors. So you went to the right hospital, you happened to have the right physician that gave you the right treatment, that did and you exercise like you were supposed to when you were eating right. So there's personal and systematic characteristics that are all involved in what your final outcome is going to be. So when we talk about measuring outcomes, there's lots of different things that we can measure. So we can measure physical symptoms. So you go to your doctor and you say, hey, my back hurts. And you can give some type of rating as to how bad your back hurts. You can measure mental systems. So there's all kinds of measure tools that are designed to assess whether or not you have depression, whether or not you have anxiety, whether or not you have all of these obsessive compulsive disorder, various other mental conditions. You can assess functional status. Functional status is different from physical symptoms. Physical symptoms is me walking in and saying, hey, my back really hurts. Functional status is assessing whether or not I can walk up a flight of stairs because of my back pain, right? So functional is the things that you can do. And sometimes your physical symptoms and your functional status are not wonderfully correlated with each other. You can also look at quality of life. So quality of life incorporates a lot of individual perceptions about health and healthcare and your baseline state. And there's a lot of attempt to put monetary value on quality of life, and everyone agrees that we need to talk about it and we need to assess it. No one agrees to how. So some people want to say, okay, well, we're gonna stop at that. We'll move on to the next slide. So there's a bunch of different ways to assess quality of life. The first is generic measures. So generic measures are trying to assess quality of life regardless of what disease or condition that you have. They're meant for broad populations, and we use them a lot oftentimes to compare quality of life of various people across different groups that might be really disparate. So a lot of times they try to capture your physical, psychological, social aspects of health. Sometimes they capture more domains. There's a lot of debate as to how many domains actually help or constitute health and well-being. So physical, psychological, and social, I think everybody agrees on, but then there's also spiritual health, sexual health, vitality, all these things that people count as part of health. And so you have to decide which of those domains you want to measure. And various generic measures will measure different types of those domains. The idea behind generic measures, though, is that they measure breadth. Right? They're not going to specifically drill down to whether or not you have pain in your toe, and that's affecting your quality of life. Generally, on a broad base, are they? The good thing about that is that transcends disease. So you can compare quality of life amongst people with different disease states. However, they're not necessarily sensitive to change in people within a particular disease state. So they can't really tell if a person's quality of life has gotten better over time because they're just not that sensitive to that. They're good for making comparisons about general statements about the quality of life in this group versus the quality of life in that group. There's also disease or condition-specific measures. Now these measures are the ones that drill down to whether or not that pain in the toe that you have in your toe is influencing your own personal quality of life. You can have clinical or experiential measures. Clinical measures usually look at signs and symptoms and tests. So clinical tests. Obviously, like what is the actual mobility in your shoulder? Can you lift your arm all the way up? Can you walk across the street? Can you walk up a flight of stairs? Those types of things. Experiential measures are trying to capture the impact of disease on the patient. So it's all good and well if I go to a physical therapist and they rate the flexibility in my shoulder, right? And they say I have great flexibility in my shoulder. Or they say I have moderate flexibility, right? I can only reach to here. Well, for some people, reaching to here, that's good enough. They don't need to reach any farther. They don't care. The quality of life is fine. They can reach as far as they want. For other people, reaching to here is not enough. They need to be able to reach all the way over their head. And so their quality of life is significantly impacted. So experiential measures are really talking about how not being able to go up here is actually influencing and impacting the way that you live and feel on a day-to-day basis. Condition-specific measures are designed to be sensitive to small changes. So they're designed to be able to tell, if I give you this intervention, has your quality of life gotten better within a specific disease condition? So we use all this information, and sometimes people can calculate quality adjusted life years. Has anybody heard that phrase before? Anybody want to take a stab as what it means? Yeah.
Just like based on like the quality of life, like a full year may not be like a full year.
Right, exactly. So essentially we are saying a full year of high quality life, right, is worth 1 year. And then any type of functional disability or impairment, we try to put some number on it and say what percentage of a year that's really worth. So is it worth having 5 full years at 50% capacity? Or is it worth, which is better, 1 full year of life at 100% and then you die? Or 5 years of life where you can't walk or are blind or whatever and then you die? Right? That's how they determine the numerical values for this. They give people all these types of questions where they're saying, would you rather have this or this? Would you rather have this or this? And then they determine that cut point, and then they assign a value to each specific impairment. And then they calculate a quality adjusted life year. So your life without a leg may be worth 1 year, or maybe worth a third of a full year, right? Not worth as in you're worthless, but that's how they assign it when they're trying to do cost analysis and trying to look at, make comparisons between treatments. But they have to look at patient preferences as far as what patients want. Would a patient rather have 1 year, like feeling great, operating, and then just die, or would a patient rather have 5 years in a wheelchair? Those types of trade-offs. And those are personal decisions, but in aggregate they get a general idea of what they do. But so in general, you end up coming up with a weight from 0 to 1. 0 means you're dead. 1 means you're awesome. Problem being is that some people think that there are things that are worse than death. Right? And none of these qualities get assigned negative numbers, right? But anyway, this is how they assign these values. The way they do this, there's 3 methods: the time trade-off, the standard gamble, and then a visual analog scale. So a time trade-off, we ask people to choose. So I say, would you remain in a state of ill health for whatever reason for a period of time, or would you rather be able to restore to perfect health but die in a shorter amount of time? The standard gamble is asking people to choose between remaining in a state of ill health for a period of time or having some type of medical intervention that has some certain chance of either restoring them to perfect health or killing them. And the visual analog scale asks people to rate, they essentially get a line, and you rate at what point on that line between 0 and 100 represents death, or the state of ill health between 0 and 100 that you feel when 0 is death and 100 is perfect health. Where do you think that particular state falls on that continuum? Let's just look at a quick example. So this is an example of a time trade-off. You're told you have 10 years left to live. You can live these 10 years in your present health state, or you can give up some years of your life and live for a shorter period of time in full health. Which would you rather do? So we're really looking for how many years of full health is equal to 10 years in your current health state. And your current health state is assuming that you're not in perfect health. It's assuming that you have some functional disability. The standard gamble, there's treatment X. Treatment X exists. Would you take it if the chance of death were 80%, but the chance of full health were 20%? Or would you prefer to remain where you are? And then they alter those numbers and they look, okay, what if the chance of death were 50% and the chance of full health were 50%? And they look to see where people decide it's worth it to get that surgery that might kill you. And then visual analog scale, it's from nothing to everything, and you just mark a line. Anyone want to guess how they analyze that? They measure it with a ruler. So being 1 millimeter off this way, I don't know. I'm not super keen on the visual analog scale as a reliable and accurate measure of quality of life, but people use it. Anyway, so why do we care about any of this information at all? What are we using these health outcomes for? We're using them for benchmarking, so making comparisons between hospitals, between clinics, between doctors, making comparisons and saying, okay, your hospital is performing at this rate, but if you want to get reimbursed for your services from Medicare, you need to be performing at this rate. We use them to develop practice guidelines. So we do all this research in order to figure out what is going to work for which people. So you can develop guidelines for practice and say, these are the best practices, your evidence base. We can use it for health status assessment. So to figure out how sick people are based on what we know about particular outcomes. And then we can look at quality of healthcare services. Now, so we've talked about outcomes. You can't really talk about health services research without talking about economic evaluation. And I am going to put forth that economic evaluation is not my area of expertise. I know just enough to be really dangerous and not enough to be proficient. But I do know enough to talk about it in general in the context of this class. So what we want to know in economic evaluation is like, is your service worth providing? Is it an economically feasible option? So relative to other healthcare services, does this service cost a lot more money? Does it have a lot more benefit? And then the other question is really, is the population satisfied with this service compared to some other service that would consume the same resources? So, are we satisfied with our service that's trying to reduce teen pregnancy, or would we rather have that same amount of money to reduce teenage drinking? So to answer these questions, we have to have some formal method of evaluation. We have to somehow look at it. We can't just poll everybody on the street. Well, I guess you technically could poll everybody on the street, but I don't know if that'd be effective use of your time. So there's a couple ways people go about this. So we have cost effectiveness analysis. So in cost effectiveness analysis, we're comparing 2 or more alternative programs. The important thing, though, is that the consequences have to be measured in common units. So the consequences, the outcomes, if your outcome is in dollars, it has to be in dollars in both programs. So the policy, sorry, lost my place. So we're looking at we have two policies, or we have 2 services, or 2 interventions. And we calculate the ratio of the cost of that intervention to its impact on our outcome of interest. And the one with the lowest ratio is said to be the most cost effective. So if we were looking at intervention A and intervention B, and the consequence we're interested in is years of life saved, we find the ratio of how much it cost to how many years of life saved for intervention A, and how much intervention B costs to how many years of life saved. Whichever one has the lowest ratio, we take that one. In cost-benefit analysis, we're comparing the cost of a policy to its benefits. So we're not comparing one intervention to another. We're saying, okay, here's this intervention, how much does it cost and how much benefit do we expect to receive from it? Both the costs and the benefits have to be measured in monetary units. So usually dollars, but it could be euros or pounds, whatever. But if a policy generates more dollars, or if it costs less than the amount of dollars of benefit that we get, then we deem that it's a cost-effective, or the benefits exceed the cost, what am I trying to say? And that it would be a worthwhile intervention. So, cost-effectiveness analysis, we're comparing 2 interventions against each other. Cost-benefit analysis, we're comparing the cost of one intervention to how much benefit we expect to gain from that same intervention. Make sense? Let's see. So, just as a depiction for cost effectiveness, we take the ratio of how much does it cost and how much outcomes were averted. Or how much disease did we manage to avert? How many life years did we save? And And we take that ratio and compare intervention A to intervention B. Alright, now the important thing about, or the difficult thing about any type of cost analysis, cost effectiveness, cost benefit, and then there's also cost utility analysis, but we're not going to talk about that. The perspective from which the analysis is performed. What do you count as a cost? Right? So you're taking a broad perspective and trying to include anything that could potentially be considered a cost for that particular intervention, or are you taking a very narrow perspective where you're only talking about the cost of supplies and people? You can come up with very different results based on what you include in your cost analysis, right? So it's important to recognize what perspective people are coming from and how broadly or narrowly they're defining what gets included as a cost, what gets included as a benefit, what gets, well, life years saved is generally a little bit more specific, but when we're talking about costs, are you counting how much it costs to light the building or not? Things like that, right? Okay. We have one more exercise. This one we're going to do in small groups of 3 or so. Yeah. How many people are here? There's a lot of people missing today. Okay, get in groups of 5. This is the table you need. Here are the questions. It's been 20 minutes, and then we'll come back the last 10 minutes to talk about. Here, you take that one, and then pass it on. So, just 5. Groups of 5, really quickly walk through. Oh, I should probably tell you exactly what the point is. So here you're a consultant to a local legislature. Yeah. So you want to know, you have been asked, as in your consulting capacity, to determine the best means of reducing morbidity and mortality associated with bicycle riding in your county in New York. So in order to provide this evidence, this advice, you have to be able to interpret the available data, which is here. So we don't have local data on morbidity because of the lack of uniform reporting of such injuries. But we do have mortality data for bicycle injuries. Let's see. The number of fatalities associated with bicycle use in a community of this size is too small to be able to be useful for analysis. But the New York State Department is able to provide you with extra information. So this isn't just your county. This is at a larger scale. But this is the information on bicycle fatality in New York. And you need to determine, based on the questions that are given, some advice as to what's going to be a good way to reduce mortality and morbidity associated with bicycle riding. Quickly. Alright, so we're going to talk about bicycle helmet stuff, and then quickly talk about your homework, and that will be it. So, what about the differences in bicycle injury and mortality by age and sex? Let's start with age. What did you notice?
Teenagers.
Those darn teenagers and their feelings of invulnerability. Yeah. There's a lot of accidents where teenagers seem to get in trouble a little bit more than others. What about by sex? Yes. Why do you think the teenage boys are having so many accidents?
Because boys will be boys.
Because teenage boys are
I would say it's deaths, not necessarily accidents.
Yes, you're right. It is deaths. Yes.
I would say because at least as far as I know, most guys are want to be cool, so they're I'm not gonna wear my helmet. So that's a cool thing. At least that's how it was back home.
Because teenage boys are stupid. Really, is what it boils down to. I know you guys managed to make it through your teenage boy years, and you have gotten smarter, and you're all brilliant now, right? But I bet that a fair number of you were not super sharp in the risk-taking department when you were teenagers. Yeah. Or even small children. I've seen little boys just run off the side of the jungle gym. They just, I don't know what it is about little boys. They have no fear. And the girls are like, in general. All right. So how would this information help you formulate prevention strategies for your community? So you made a very good point. These are just deaths. We know nothing about people that were just in accidents based on this information. But if you only had this information, and you were charged with coming up with an idea for some types of prevention strategies to at least prevent deaths from bicycle injuries, what would you want to do? Does this information give you any help? Jason, back there. Yeah.
Well, we could focus on community outreach efforts to actually use the helmet.
Where would you focus those? But in the general community?
Or general community. All over, because as you can see, it's focused in male teenage, but it's all over.
You're right, it is all over. Now let's say you had this much money. Would you target it more specifically, or would you still choose to look at the general community?
Of course, I would.
There's no right answer. There's absolutely no right answer. It depends on what your goals are.
Specifically.
Yeah. Somebody else.
Well, I was gonna say target wherever that age group males will be, or high schools or whatever that target audience and where you can find them.
Yeah, maybe you come up with some really, it's cool to wear your helmet campaign for high schools, because that would be really effective.
Pamphlets in primary care offices.
Yeah. What you have to do is you have to get all the moms, and you have to get the moms on board, and then you get the moms to yell at their teenage sons, who at least will do it when their moms are watching, which would be very rarely, but I don't know. I have no good answer for this particular problem. All right, so let's move on to question number 4. Why did the authors choose to do a case control study for this particular problem? So you read your little case control study thing. Why did they choose to use case control to examine effectiveness of bicycles? Yeah.
You can't really do a random control trial.
It'd be slightly unethical to randomly assign people to wear a helmet or not wear a helmet, and then send them on their way on city streets on bicycles, right? Probably couldn't do that. What about a cohort study? Why wouldn't we do that?
Take too long to complete.
Would take too long to complete. I had a really good reason that I wrote down and now I forgot it.
Cases are too low.
What? I'm sorry?
No.
I don't know. A case control study can be readily done with minimal effort and minimal funding, right? And in general, you can get, I keep pointing out that's not the case control study. In general, you can get some decent information from it, especially if you're looking at prevention planning, right? Let's see. Moving on. What kind of biases might be associated with the case control study?
You're using proxy to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so in the case control study, with the case control study, they weren't dead, were they? No, these were serious head injuries.
Yes.
You might not remember that.
Right. Well, so who were the cases, and then they had 2 groups of controls, right? Who were the cases? People with head injuries that went to the emergency room. Yeah, bicycle riding head injuries. Yes. Now, what was the first control group? Because there were 2.
They're from the ER, right?
Yes, and they were bicycle injuries. They just weren't head injuries, right?
Yes.
And what was the second group?
HMO.
Yeah, so people who had injuries, but that didn't get shipped off to the ER. So great, yeah. What?
It was it was acute and then outpatient. Kind of those scenarios don't correlate, so there's a little bias there.
Well, you're getting very, very close to it's not that because the people, everybody that went to the ER had some type of an acute injury, right?
But not.
But you're right in the fact that the head trauma was more severe, probably than, I don't know, someone might have gotten a leg ripped off. I don't have any idea. But the head trauma was probably more severe. But the bias doesn't come from the type of injury, right? The type of injury itself isn't the bias. The bias comes from the fact that the people with the head injuries may have been partaking in more riskier behavior.
So are you saying that the people in the HMO setting are more injured?
No, I'm saying the people in the HMO setting are probably much less injured.
Much less?
Or they are less injured. And so they may have fewer, so the people in the HMO setting may have been riding on country roads that don't have a lot of traffic, that and abiding by the traffic rules, whereas the people with the head injury might have been in the middle of a city street with huge traffic, riding very quickly and darting across and doing all kinds of stupid things.
I mean, not just that. I mean, if you have a bicycle accident and you just get up and walk away from it, then like that's not in this at all either. So if the
Right.
helmet prevented your, like if you fell on the road and your helmet broke your fall and like you weren't hurt because of that, that doesn't get
Right, and you wouldn't show up at all.
Yeah.
Right. So the selection of cases and controls could lead to potential biases just because the people, they may have been different types of people, right? We kind of commented on the comparability between cases and controls in that kind of thing. So what information provided by the study regarding effectiveness of bicycle helmets is generalizable? Do you think this is generalizable nationwide, or do you think this is probably generalizable within that particular region?
I mean, I feel like no matter where you go, teenage males are going to have the majority.
Teenage boys are stupid?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to take the most risks out of any age group. So.
Now, the one, yes, I think teenage boys are teenage boys wherever you are
Yeah.
in the universe. But when we're talking about the case control study, we're talking about generalizing those results. We may or may not be able to generalize them to places with different terrain. It was what, in Puget Sound, is that right? So if that Puget Sound is like really hilly and windy and curvy and everything, the risk factors there for bicycle injury may be substantially different than someone who's in the middle of like Texas where there's no cars and no hills and no anything, and your bigger risk is getting bitten by a scorpion or something, or stung by a scorpion. They don't bite, basically. So you have to look, but then in general, it's like even if the terrain is different, if we're looking at head injuries and whether or not it prevents severe head injuries, if you can maybe control for the terrain in other studies, you could get around that, right? Who knows? Maybe bicycle helmets only prevent head injuries on flat roads, which is possible, right? So that's something that you have to think about with the generalizability. You guys said you didn't make it much past number 7,
Yeah.
which is fine. Homework. Don't do anything in Blackboard that's labeled homework. What I want you to do for your homework is to come up with the 3 muddiest points of the semester for you. The 3 things out of this semester that are just not clear. I want you to write those down, full sentence questions, and bring them to class next week. And that is how we're going to review. Yes?
Repeat that again, I'm sorry.
The 3 muddiest points, the 3 things from this entire semester that are making the least sense to you, that really you need clarification on. And bring them to class, and we will consolidate that information, and if everybody's muddiest point is the same thing, we will talk about that. Yes, that is your homework, because I want everybody to prepare for the review. So go ahead and turn it in on Blackboard just so I have a list of everything, but serious.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, 6, right?
Good meeting.
Yeah. Oh, maybe.
Which might be similar to pieces of stuff like there was. And then divided through